Good day. Over the last couple of hours, even as the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and I will discuss all of that shortly, we've received confirmation that President Biden of the United States has in effect summoned President Zelenskyy of Ukraine, who has been to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, where he has attended the inauguration of the newly elected Argentine president, Mr. Milei. Anyway, President Biden has now summoned President Zelenskyy to Washington, and that the two men are supposed to meet each other on Tuesday. It is far from clear, to me at least, as of this time, exactly what the purpose of this meeting is. There's an assumption on the part of some people that this is intended to be part of some lobbying exercise to try to persuade Congress, the Republicans in Congress, the ones in both the Senate and the House, to reverse their position on aid to Ukraine at some point over the next couple of days, before Congress rises for its Christmas break on the 15th of December. And that certainly is one possibility. However, I do have some issues with that particular idea. Firstly, on the last occasion that President Zelenskyy was in the United States, which is just a few weeks ago, back in September, if I remember rightly, it's by general agreement accepted that the visit did not go at all well, that the various officials who met with President Zelenskyy came away somewhat unimpressed, and one does wonder whether, in fact, it is going to be the case that sending him on a lobbying expedition in Congress, far from changing anybody's minds there, might, on the contrary, harden opinion against further aid to Ukraine even further. Anyway, that's one thing. Second thing to say is that I would have thought by now that the Biden White House would understand that even if President Zelenskyy were the most gifted speaker in the world, the most charming and persuasive personality, minds in Congress look largely made up. I saw a program yesterday in which J.D. Vance, one of the Republican senators, somebody who's been consistently skeptical about the issue of aid to Ukraine, anyway, he was saying that in order to progress this matter further, the issue of Ukraine further, both the United States and Ukraine need to accept the reality that Ukraine is going to have to make significant territorial concessions. And Vance spoke in a way of the United States facing competing demands, being under pressure in various places, and having to make decisions on that sort of basis, all of which suggested that for him, Ukraine is no longer, if it has ever been, much of a priority. And I suspect that this is a sentiment that is becoming widespread in Congress, and perhaps not just amongst Republicans. Beyond that, there's now been an opinion poll about what the general feeling of the US public on the question of aid to Ukraine is. And this opinion poll, interestingly enough, was heavily covered by the Financial Times. The Financial Times, the one newspaper published in Britain that has consistently seemed to me to be closest to the thinking of the Biden administration and of the US government, which I believe is often used by the Biden administration as a sounding board for its policies in Europe, and which has been, up to this point, a loyal follower of the Biden administration's policies on Ukraine. Anyway, this opinion poll, which for a time was the lead story in the Financial Times, showed that a significant plurality of American voters, 47%, now believe that aid to Ukraine, that the United States is providing too much aid to Ukraine. This against just 27% who think that the United States is providing enough, and 11% who think that the United States should provide even more aid than it is currently doing. So 47% appear to believe that aid to Ukraine should be reduced. And I get the sense that with every passing week, with every passing month, that number of people in the United States who are skeptical about the idea of providing Ukraine with aid is increasing. So, coming back to the purpose of Zelensky's visit, maybe Zelensky is indeed being summoned to the United States in order to get him to conduct some kind of lobbying exercise. Stranger things have happened, and it could be that some people in the administration still have fond and illusory beliefs about President Zelensky's persuasive skills, which are invisible, at least to me. So maybe that is what this is all about. But I wonder whether the actual purpose of this visit is for the Biden White House to pass on to Zelensky personally difficult and uncomfortable news, and to do so through the person of the president himself, of Joe Biden himself. Whether just possibly it might be the case that the administration is now going to tell Zelensky that the game essentially is up, that there is little more that the United States realistically can do, and that negotiations of some kind with the Russians must therefore begin. This is a guess. I'm not sure that this is correct. But then again, I think anybody who assumes that they know exactly what the purpose of this summons of Zelensky to Washington is actually about, anyway, I think that anybody who says that they know outside the administration itself is almost certainly wrong. So far, we only have a very limited quantity of news as to what it is exactly that the administration itself is thinking. If this guess that the administration is unhappy about the stance that President Zelensky has been taking up to now, which is basically to continue the war until victory, and to explain to him that the days of American aid are now coming to an end, and that he's in his own interests and in Ukraine's interests, he needs to talk to the Russians. If that is the intention behind this visit, then I predict that the Americans are going to find Zelensky a very difficult person to persuade. Whilst in Buenos Aires, President Zelensky had a meeting with Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, who was also in Buenos Aires to attend President Milei's inauguration. Now, we don't yet know what the two men said to each other, but there is a video circulating of the two in conversation And one gets the sense that the meeting was not going well, that it was a tense and unfriendly discussion. Both seem to be unhappy. Zelensky, if I may say so, especially so. There's certainly no signs of smiles or anything of that sort. And Orban is seen gesticulating in a way that suggests to me that he was trying to get Zelensky to understand some basic facts about the realities of the situation, both economic, military, diplomatic, and political, and was running into a brick wall. So maybe the President of the United States, obviously an immeasurably more powerful man than the Prime Minister of Hungary, is going to find it easier to convey any bad news to President Zelensky and to get him to change his stance. But I do wonder whether it will be easy, and with Zelensky apparently in the current mood that he is in, it might in fact prove to be extraordinarily difficult. Now, one of the reasons why I think it may be the case that the intention of the administration, of the White House, in summoning Zelensky to Washington is to impress on him some of the current political and military realities. Well, one of the reasons why I think that might be the case is that we've had another article in the Financial Times, and this article is a follow-up on a previous article that appeared a few days ago, also in the Financial Times, which for the first time conceded that there are now tensions between President Zelensky and his chief military commander, General Zelenskyy, and that President Zelensky has come to see General Zelenskyy as a political rival, and which also covered the negative comments about President Zelensky that had been made recently by the mayor of Kiev, Mr. Klitschko. Well, this latest article in the Financial Times, the one that has come out today, goes beyond that. And its title says, Ukrainians question Volodymyr Zelenskyy's rose-tinted speeches. Former and current advisors say lack of realism in president's messaging is undermining confidence. And the article from Isabel Koshev in Kiev goes on to say, for more than 650 days in a row, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has given at least one video address to the nation, praising his troops, celebrating advances along the front lines, and reaffirming resolve in the face of Russian aggression. The message is always, we are moving forward with the aim of maintaining optimism at home and abroad, according to three people familiar with the communications strategy. The policy is applied to all state levels, from ministries and local administrations to military commanders, and includes strict censorship of bad news, such as Ukrainian casualty numbers or successful Russian strikes. Now, notice the last 2 points. That all but admits that Ukrainian casualty numbers, with news about which unquestionably is being suppressed, that if the news about Ukrainian casualty numbers were published, that would be bad news. And it also effectively concedes that there have been successful Russian missile strikes, and that the ceaseless claims Ukraine has been making that they've been able to shoot down practically every drone and missile that the Russians launch against them, that is simply not true. And then the article continues, but with Ukraine enjoying few military achievements this year and Western support faltering, the communications strategy is creating a rift between the presidential administration and military leadership, say officials from the armed forces. In other words, military people have been talking to the Financial Times, and they've been complaining about Zelensky's over-optimistic messaging strategy. We hear that it's also the view expressed by former presidential staffers. I wonder who that is, and communications strategists. And I wonder who that refers to as well. Could it conceivably be, for example, Alexei Arestovich, who was once President Zelensky's spokesman? And then the article goes on to say that we need to add more realism, and we have to be as courageous about it as we were on February 24th, 2022. And the article continues, military leaders have argued that the gap between official messaging and the situation on the ground is no longer convincing and not motivating Ukrainians or the country's Western partners. And the article then goes on to say that Zelensky's optimistic message is supposed to reassure Ukraine doubters in the West and shore up confidence amongst Ukrainian businesses, a vital source of tax revenue for the war effort, but that it is in reality clearly annoying and antagonizing everyone else. And then there is specific criticism of the media approach, the line the President Zelensky and his officials took over the conflict in Bakhmut. They say that official channels on Telegram and other social media branded the fight with slogans such as Fortress Bakhmut and Unbreakable Bakhmut, which disappeared in the days before Russia declared victory. Zelensky never officially acknowledged, this is absolutely the case, he has never officially acknowledged Ukraine's retreat from Bakhmut. And in June, the Defense Ministry presented continued Ukrainian attacks from the edge of the town as evidence it had not lost the battle. By the way, that is also true, the last is also true, and the Western media, including the British media, by the way, including, as I seem to remember, the Financial Times itself, at that time took Zelensky and his people at their word. They continued to reproduce the claims that Ukraine was counterattacking in Bakhmut and was about to recapture the place. And the article goes on to say, and there is a quotation here from a former staffer, could that be Arestovich? That the communications package covered up the incredible levels of exhaustion, the suffering of thousands of families, enormous numbers of daily deaths, the tension and the doubt. By glossing over bad news, the view from abroad was of two propagandists fighting propaganda narratives. And then we hear that the news media, the television channels in Ukraine, as a result, are starting to lose credibility and are no longer gaining the attention that they once did. Now, this is a most unusual article. It is one that many people in the West, many people in Britain, are going to find novel. In Britain in particular, as Zelensky has been built up to a figure of Churchillian dimensions. The idea that he has been spreading propaganda, giving rosy accounts of what is actually a disastrous situation, that he has been concealing the very large number of deaths, the military defeats, that he's been pretending that victory is around the corner when it is not. Well, it might come as a shock to many people. But to repeat again, the Financial Times is a newspaper which, as I have noticed over the last 3 years, does seem to be very close to the Biden administration. And I do wonder whether this article, which is being given a great deal of prominence in the Financial Times today, might actually be reflecting American disenchantment with President Zelensky himself, and might be a message to him and perhaps to other people in Ukraine that this constant barrage of so-called good news has in fact all undermined, not strengthened, Ukraine's and Zelensky's credibility in the United States and in the West, and given the extent to which Zelensky himself is now so identified with it, perhaps if he is not prepared to take the step of opening negotiations with the Russians, the moment has come for him to go. Anyway, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens over the course of these discussions in Washington. We'll see whether Zelensky is asked to meet the Congress people. We'll see what their response to him is. We'll see what the results are over the next few days. But it is clear now that we are at a critical moment, and the fact that the White House has urgently summoned Zelensky to Washington is a clear indicator of this. Anyway, it's not just Zelensky, by the way, who continues to peddle impossible, fantastic, good news about the state of the fighting. The man who I have come to believe is Zelensky's favorite general, General Syrskyi, the man who failed to defend Bakhmut, the man who failed to recapture Bakhmut, the man who is still in overall command of Ukraine's forces in the northern part of the front lines, the man who is also known to be a rival and on bad terms with the overall military commander, General Zaluzhny. General Syrskyi has now also made some pretty astonishing claims of his own. And he has said that Russian troops are continuing their offensive on the Kupiansk, Liman and Bakhmut direction. However, they're suffering heavy losses in manpower, and they're supposedly losing 8 men for every soldier that Ukraine is losing. And the Ukrainians, despite everything, despite the difficult conditions and continuous offensive actions of the occupiers, as Syrskyi calls them, are steadfastly holding the occupied lines, showing high professionalism, courage and heroism. Commanders and staffs of all levels are analysing the operational situation around the clock in cooperation with other branches of the armed forces of Ukraine and developing effective ways to further destroy the enemy. And Zelenskyy tells us that unlike the Russians, the Ukrainians are trying to achieve success through successful tactical actions, accurate artillery, mortars, attack drones, and small arms fire. And supposedly in November alone, the Russians lost 1,100 pieces of military equipment, 130 tanks, 260 pieces of artillery and mortars of various calibers, and that since the start of the special military operation, the Russians have lost 339,850 people, 5,655 tanks, and hundreds of pieces of military equipment. So that is what General Zelenskyy is telling us. Now, an official of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, who was sacked some months ago, Hanna Maliar, who is presumably still in contact with people in the Ukrainian military, tells us a very different story. Today, she is reported to have written on her Telegram channel, the Kupiansk, Liman, Bakhmut, Marinka, and Avdiivka directions. In all these directions, the situation is tense. Intense fighting is underway in all 5 directions. So, Hanna Maliar does not seem to share General Zelensky's blissful optimism about the situation, nor is she claiming that the Ukrainians inflict 8 casualties on the Russians for every casualty that they suffer themselves. Anyway, there we are. What is the actual situation on the battle lines? Well, as always, especially with a Russian offensive, or rather maybe not offensive exactly, but with Russian pressure along the battle lines being as wide-placed and as broad as it is, it's not always entirely straightforward to tell. But briefly, it does seem as if the Russians have now gained significant control of significant new areas within the fortified perimeter of Avdiivka itself. I'm getting increasingly the impression that there are essentially 2 battles for Avdiivka going on. The encounter battle that's going on to the northwest, the one between the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Russians near the railway track and in the villages of Stepnoye and Berdichi. This battle goes backwards and forwards. The Russians supposedly launched more attacks last night. The Ukrainians suffered further losses. The Ukrainians, however, counterattack. This is a bitter counter battle, with neither side so far gaining a decisive ascendancy, but with the 47th Mechanized Brigade and presumably the other Ukrainian units in the area continuing to suffer increasing numbers of losses. Anyway, that is one battle. And then there is the other battle, which is taking place closer to Avdiivka itself. In fact, in the area around Avdiivka, further down in the sack, the sock that is Avdiivka, and here the Russians are pressing forward literally every day. They are registering every day advances in this area. And from what I can tell, what they seem to be doing is that they're gradually, incrementally, steadily taking control of all the fortified positions that the Ukrainians have created around the residential area of Avdiivka. They are, in other words, shrinking the pocket before they launch a concerted attack on Ukrainian positions in the town itself. And of course, the Ukrainian 110th Brigade, which is trying to hold onto Avdiivka, is coming under immense pressure and is suffering losses all the time. And the men of this brigade have repeatedly complained that they're not being rotated, that they're tired and exhausted, that they're running short of supplies, that their commanders have abandoned them, and that they're being expected to fight against increasingly impossible odds. Now, I saw a report yesterday, and again, I have to say I forget where I saw it, but it might have been on Slavyangrad, it may have been somewhere else, that there are up to 40 battalions of Ukrainian troops trying to defend Avdiivka. Now, that gives us a sense of the scale of the effort that Ukraine is putting in trying to hold Avdiivka. And despite the fact that there are 40 battalions, say around 20,000 men, perhaps, defending Avdiivka, it nonetheless remains the case that it is the Russians who continue to advance. And if we assume that the Ukrainians do indeed have 40 battalions around Avdiivka, and if we guess from that a total Ukrainian force of around 20,000 men, then it may not be so difficult to understand why the Russians are continuing to make progress, because according to the Ukrainians themselves, and this seems to be corroborated by Russian sources, the Russians have assembled a force of around 40,000 men in and around Avdiivka. In other words, despite this huge Ukrainian effort to defend Avdiivka, the Russians almost certainly outnumber the Ukrainians in the area, perhaps by a factor of 2 to 1. And of course, the Russians are backed by artillery, which is generously equipped with large amounts of shells, unlike the Ukrainian troops, who are, by their own account, limited to 5 shells a day for each artillery piece. And the Russians have swarms of drones, far more than the Ukrainians do. And of course, the Russians have their air force, which is also active in this area, and which has been bombing Ukrainian positions on a regular basis. So despite what looks like a Herculean effort by the Ukrainians to hold Avdiivka, it is not surprising that they're being ground down and that the situation in Avdiivka is becoming more difficult for the Ukrainians by the hour. And there's also, very interestingly now, been a cascade of comments by Ukrainian channels, Telegram channels. They're also starting to appear on Twitter, on X, I should say, and in other places. Comments, criticisms coming from within Ukraine about the entire logic of the operation in Krinky, the establishment of this bridgehead on the Russian-controlled east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, a place where several hundred Ukrainian Marines have been effectively trapped for months now in horrendous conditions, where the losses that these Ukrainian troops suffer is appalling, and where there is no sign of any sort of Ukrainian breakthrough, and essentially a loss of hope in Ukraine that such a breakthrough is even possible. There was a long piece about this battle by Strana, one of the Ukrainian websites, one of the best Ukrainian websites, by the way. They're very, very interesting news organization. Anyway, Strana is questioning the entire logic of trying to maintain this bridgehead. It does raise some questions about what the Russians are up to around Kriki as well. But I noticed that these concerns about Kriki are now being picked up by other people in Ukraine. Dima at the Military Summary channel has also picked up on these complaints about the bridgehead in Kriki, though oddly enough he's not mentioned, as far as I'm aware, the first article about it, which was in Strana. Anyway, the long and the short of it is people in Ukraine are now starting openly to say, what is the point of maintaining this bridgehead? The Ukrainian troops there cannot advance. They're suffering heavy losses every day. Every day, dozens of brave men are being killed for no rational purpose. The Russians have this bridgehead contained. The losses are high. Men's lives are being sacrificed and thrown away, and no one can see the rationale for doing this. And it's been suggested, or at least suggested in some places, that perhaps the time has therefore now come to pull these troops in Kriki out of Kriki, to abandon this effort to maintain this bridgehead. The costs have been inordinate, and the benefits of in military terms, have been nil. Now, whether or not this does happen is another matter. President Zelenskyy, no doubt, always wanting to convey to the West optimistic news. Many Western publications, especially in Britain, by the way, have talked up the presence of Ukrainian troops on the east bank of the Dnieper as proof that Ukraine does still retain the initiative in the war, does still have chances of victory in the war. I would have thought that President Zelenskyy, trapped as he is within these narratives of success, is going to find it very difficult indeed to agree to the withdrawal of these troops. But the fact is that for the first time that I know of, and I've never seen this happen to this extent in the war up to now, there are now demands, there are significant demands in Ukraine from various people to bring this pointless, futile operation to Kriki to an end. We'll see, as I said, what President Zelenskyy does. And I noticed, and this is a follow-up from the program yesterday, I said that yesterday that a Mr. Green, a Ukrainian commander, has appeared and has made comments about the fact that Ukraine needs to retreat, give up large territories, give up all the gains that it achieved in the Kharkiv offensive of last year in order to withdraw to more defendable lines. I noticed that the German journalist Julian Röpke of Bild Zeitung is also now saying that Ukraine may have to do that very thing, that is the only realistic thing that the Ukrainians can do. It is to withdraw to these more defendable lines. And it won't just be in Kriki, apparently. We're getting lots of reports now from the Bakhmut area. The Russians are claiming that they're now pushing forward towards Ivanivska, this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, again on the road to Chasiv Yar. It's a village that the Wagner organization never captured. Apparently, Ivaniska, village the Russians call Krasnoye, is now being shelled by the Russians. The Russians have been steadily, methodically capturing the high ground in this area, high ground near Klashevka, which they lost. They formally gained control of. The Wagner organization gained control of it during its offensive in Bakhmut, against Bakhmut earlier this year. The Ukrainians then recaptured the high ground near Klashevka in the bitter fighting that took place in the summer. The Russians are now methodically capturing it. And further north, around Bogdanovka, they continue to capture more of the high ground. They're starting to conduct what, to my completely inexpert eyes, looks like a gradual encirclement of Bogdanovka itself before they launch an attack upon it. They have apparently gained control of more of the road leading into Bakhmut from Chasov Yar, the former Road of Death, as it was called during the fighting before the fall of Bakhmut in the spring. And there's even some claims, which I'm straightforwardly say I don't really understand, that the Russians might even be thinking of advancing and capturing Chasov Yar itself before they take control of Bogdanovka. That, by the way, I don't expect. But anyway, it does look as if the situation in Bogdanovka around Bakhmut is deteriorating fast. And there have also been more reports now from Marinka. About a week ago, there was photos of Russian soldiers raising a flag on the western outskirts of Marinka, claiming that the entire town was under Russian control. The Russian Defense Ministry never confirmed that, and since then it's been acknowledged that the Ukrainians maintained a presence in a small area on the northwest fringe of Marinka. The British Defense Ministry referred to this as a pocket. Yesterday there was another photo of Russian troops advancing northward towards this pocket, raising a further flag. They seem to be getting closer and closer to where the remaining Ukrainian troops are. My own sense is that this is now essentially becoming a mopping up exercise, that the Ukrainians are still there in this small number of buildings, in this small little pocket in the northwest of Marinka, but probably a decision has already been made by the Ukrainians to withdraw from Marinka, and at some point over the next couple of days or weeks, the Russian Defense Ministry will finally announce that Marinka has finally been brought entirely under Russian control. And I suspect that this is going to happen with a minimum of fighting. And there's been many other reports of Russian advances in other places, especially in the Liman area towards the Oskol River, also, and perhaps the Severny Donetsk. I'm not, as I said, ever a person who understands the geography of this region particularly well. Map reading, as I said, is very difficult for me. And apparently, again, I'm taking this now from Dima at the Military Summary channel, the Russians have now launched their attack on Novomikhailovka, this village to the south of Marinka, which they've been working towards capturing for several weeks now. Exactly what the significance of this particular village is, I am not sure. But anyway, the overall picture, very different from the one that General Syrskyi is giving, is not of the Ukrainians successfully holding their positions, but rather of the Ukrainians being incrementally and methodically pushed back by the Russians all along the front line, suffering very heavy losses in the process, clinging on, but burning up their remaining reserves as they try to do so. So, coming back to Zelensky and his trip to Washington, if it is indeed the case that the White House is going to try to explain to Zelensky that from this point on, American aid is going to run out and that he needs to begin negotiations. Well, we can see that what is actually ultimately driving any decision of that nature is the realities on the front line. The defeat Ukraine suffered in the summer during its summer offensive, coming on top of the earlier defeat that it suffered earlier in the first half of this year in Bakhmut. And the fact that despite all the hundreds of millions of dollars of Western aid, the Russians are now on the advance. There are, however, fundamental problems with the Western strategy, if it is indeed the Western strategy, to get the Ukrainians to begin negotiations with the Russians. And I've already discussed how the Ukrainians, or at least President Zelensky himself, are probably incapable of conducting negotiations with the Russians, at least on any terms that the Russians would agree to work with, and that the Russian terms would be such that no conceivable or imaginable political leadership in Kiev could ever accept that they would amount in effect to unconditional surrender. And in fact, we've had a number of very interesting statements over the last 24 hours from senior Russian officials, which basically make precisely that point. Firstly, we've had this comment from the Russian intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, which is the Russian equivalent, if you like, of the CIA, though it doesn't have a covert operations function in the way that the CIA does. It's rather more simply an intelligence agency. Anyway, this is what Naryshkin said. And he said this over the course of a discussion, a roundtable discussion. He said the puppet regime in Kiev, note the expression, puppet regime, which is alien to the majority of Ukrainians and which has perpetrated bloody massacres in Donbass, in Odessa, and in many other towns and villages of Ukraine, will eventually and inevitably be abandoned by its overseas masters. Russians and Ukrainians are two parts of a single nation composed of three peoples, which also include Belarusians. Now, here Naryshkin is taking his theme directly from that speech of Putin's, which I discussed about a week ago, which Putin made at that civic conference in which Putin spoke about the Russian people having three branches of the same tree: Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. But they're not just fraternal people, they are in effect one nation. And we see now that that claim by Putin has now become the official position of the Russian authorities, that Ukrainians ultimately are themselves a part of the Russian nation. And then Naryshkin went on to say, despite the seriously changed circumstances, I mean the aggression of the Western Bloc against Russia, in which Ukraine is involved, I hold to the same positions on this issue, namely that Russians and Ukrainians are two parts of a triune, composed of three parts, of a triune nation, the history of which goes back centuries. The only historical purpose of Ukrainian nationalism is to turn Ukraine into a weapon against Russia. And then Naryshkin went into this in immense detail. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that the Russians don't really see much sense in negotiating with the Ukrainian government, whoever leads it, because as far as they're concerned, it is an illegitimate puppet government controlled by the West, and it is illegitimate because it is trying to deny the true, essential national reality of Ukraine, which is that it is a part of Russia. Now, this is, as I said, relatively new from the Russians, but Putin indicated this in a speech that he made, as I said, about a week ago, and we see now how Naryshkin, his intelligence chief, is adopting the same line of argument. And we've had other comments of a similar nature from other Russian officials. And we now turn to Rodion Miroshnik, who is a Russian ambassador at large for Kiev regime crimes, in itself already a interesting title for a Russian official to have. Anyway, Miroshnik conceded that negotiations will take place, the war will end in negotiations. But then consider what he goes on to say, and this again I'm taking from the TASS news agency. Negotiations will definitely take place. All the clashes necessarily end with talks. Clearly, negotiations will not be with puppets. The West does not demonstrate the desire to come to terms so far. They do not say so far that they are ready to come to the negotiating table. Conditions to start negotiations will come to fruition when sponsors will be exhausted, he means the Western powers, when political ambitions are settled down, when the Ukrainian people will eventually understand that administration currently in Ukraine is not the Ukrainian administration. So, put these comments of Naryshkin and Miroshnik together, consider them in the context of what Putin said to that civic chamber about a week ago, 10 days ago. What the Russians collectively are saying is that they're not going to negotiate with the government in Ukraine. Why should they negotiate with the government in Ukraine? It is purely, as far as they're concerned, a puppet government effectively controlled by the Western powers and whose only purpose is to keep Ukraine separated from Russia, which is Ukraine's natural home, because the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the Belarusians form together the same single people, each of them being, in effect, branches of the same Russian tree. So, given that the Ukrainian government has no legitimacy, that it is completely controlled by the West, that it is an illegitimate government, yes, negotiations will happen, but they will not happen with the government in Ukraine. They will not happen with the government in Kiev. They will happen solely between Russia and the West. By the West, obviously, the country the Russians mean is the United States. The Russians are prepared to talk to the United States about means to end the war. They're not prepared to talk to Zelensky or to anybody else who takes power in Kiev now. Not to Zelenskyy, not presumably to Arestovich, not to anyone else. And this is a further shift, a further hardening of the Russian position. And no less a person than Putin himself has also been speaking about this. He issued awards in the Kremlin, in the St. George's Hall at the Kremlin, to Russian soldiers. And he made a short speech, over the course of which he said, "I have no doubt that we will certainly achieve all the goals we have set for ourselves, and that we will be able to tell our children and grandchildren that we and our comrades in arms did this for them, that we lived, worked, and fought for their future, and they will be proud of us." Notice the words, achieve all the goals we have set for ourselves. And given that he's already spoken of Ukraine as this branch of the Russian tree that has been artificially kept away, and given what we hear these other Russian officials say, and it's important to mention that Narishkin, who is the intelligence chief, is a member of Russia's Security Council. Anyway, we can see that essentially the Russians are saying no negotiations with Kiev, complete capitulation from Kiev is the only thing that they're prepared to discuss now. If there's going to be a substantive negotiation on any topic, it must be with the West, ultimately with the United States. And of course, what that inevitably means is that as part of that negotiation, the Russians will be discussing the security situation, will want to discuss the general security situation, the security architecture in all of Europe, not just in Ukraine. So we see the extent to which the Russians have firmed up their positions. They sense that the wind is in their sails, that they're winning the war. In fact, the situation on the front lines all but confirms this. They know that their economy is becoming stronger. They know that they have a strong diplomatic support from key countries around the world. Putin has just had that triumphant visit to the Arabian Peninsula. He's received the president of Iran. He's backed by China and India, and to a great extent Brazil. He's winning the war on the battlefields. The Russians are winning the war in the battlefields. And they have now moved beyond what was being said in October by people like Volodin and Shoigu, that Ukraine has a choice between capitulating to Russian demands or disappearing entirely as a state. The Russians are now hinting that the entire existence of the Ukrainian state has no legitimacy, that to the extent that Ukrainian nationalism exists at all, it exists purely for the purpose of separating Ukraine from its natural home, which is Russia. This is the result of those months and years of delaying negotiations. We see that with every week, every month that passes, the Russian position now hardens further, and we are starting to move towards a position where the Russians are on the brink of a decision that the future lies in the complete annexation into Russia of West Bank Ukraine, minus the regions of Lviv and Galicia, which Putin, in that other speech, was careful not to mention in a way that suggests that the Russians don't regard that as part of Ukraine, properly speaking, as part of Ukraine anymore. Well, there we go. That is the situation at the present time. I am not sure that President Biden understands this. I suspect that there is some understanding of this situation today in Ukraine. I will be interested to see whether the administration does try to persuade President Zelensky to open talks with the Russians. That seems to be the only thing that the administration now can realistically think to do. There are these harebrained schemes for persisting and renewing the war in Ukraine, the ones that I discussed in Foreign Affairs. Brian Beletic has done an absolutely brilliant video on this subject. This new fantastic plan to relaunch the summer counteroffensive, to try again to isolate Crimea. All that was attempted before, which failed, you try to do it again, all over again, expecting this time a different result, even as the Russians grow stronger every day. Anyway, putting that fantasy aside, the only thing that the administration seems to be able to consider is a plan to freeze the war. Zelensky is likely to resist that. And in terms of the Russians, we can see that the reality there is that that particular train has long since left the station. The Russians are no longer talking about a neutral Ukraine. They are talking about a Ukraine that is one part of three. The Russian nation made up of its three branches, with the clear implication that its right place is in Russia. Anyway, let's see what happens over the next few days, whether in fact Zelensky will indeed be launched on Congress to try to get the Congress people to change their minds, whether there is going to be a diplomatic initiative either by the Ukrainians or by the United States, or whether the whole situation ends in a total impasse, even as the Russians continue their remorseless advance west. Dima, in his latest program, is now talking about the Russians pushing on all the way to the Dnieper, and effectively Max Tucker in the London Times, in that article which I discussed yesterday, was essentially saying the same thing. We may not be quite as close in time terms to that situation as Dima and Maxim Tucker appear to think, but I would not be surprised if at some point over the next few months that event, hugely consequential, of the Russians pushing towards the Dnieper in central Ukraine starts to float across the horizon. Well, Putin is not only concerned with events in Ukraine. Yesterday, I discussed at great length the latest diplomatic moves between the Russians and in the Middle East, the various steps that the BRICS states have been taking in the United Nations. And over the last few days, President Putin has again been busy. So on Sunday, he briefed President al-Sisi of Egypt about his talks in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, and also his meeting with President Ebrahim Raisi of Iran. Egypt, of course, is another country which is about to join the BRICS, and it is perhaps the single most important country in terms of the existing conflict that is taking place in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. Egypt has a border with Gaza. It was in control of Gaza between 1948 and 1967. Hamas has links with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And of course, Egypt was the first country, the first Arab country, to sign a peace treaty with Israel. And the Russian readout of this conversation between Putin and el-Sisi is very brief. It also says that the leaders discussed a number of issues related to Russian-Egyptian cooperation, which has been developing very successfully. Both parties expressed their interest in further expanding cooperation in various areas in a traditionally friendly manner based on the principles of strategic partnership. During the era of President Gamal Nasser in the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union and Egypt were very close. Then, during the presidency of Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Nasser, Egypt realigned with the United States. Nominally, Egypt remains a friend of the United States, but we see from these interviews, from this readout, we see from the current actions that the Egyptian government has been taking, the difficult conversations between the Egyptians and the Americans, between President Sisi and First Secretary Blinken and then President Biden himself, that the Egyptians, again, are increasingly aligning with Moscow, and of course, they're joining the BRICS. So Egypt appears to be reverting to its historic friendship with Russia, the one that it had in the 1950s and the 1960s, even as its relations with the United States deteriorate. Now, Putin also had a conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Now, historically, these two leaders have had a close and friendly relationship, though, as I've said, it would be a mistake to think of Putin and Netanyahu as allies. But we've had rather different readouts from the Russians and the Israelis about what happened over the course of these discussions. The Russians tell us that the discussion focused on the critical situation in the Palestine-Israeli conflict zone, in particular the disastrous humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Putin reaffirmed his principal opposition of rejecting and condemning terrorism in all its manifestations. So that was strongly critical of what Hamas did on the 7th of October. But then the Russian readout goes on to say, at the same time, it is of the essence to avoid such grave consequences for the civilian population whilst countering terrorist threats. Russia is ready to provide all possible assistance to alleviate the suffering of civilians and de-escalate the conflict. So that's the Russian view, that Putin was trying to get Netanyahu to understand that however bad the actions of Hamas on the 7th of October, creating a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, on top of that, is only going to make the matter worse and is ethically wrong. The Israelis, by contrast, are saying that Netanyahu complained to Putin about Russia's stance at the United Nations and about the comments that have been made by Russia's UN ambassadors, by Nebenzia and Polyansky. So we can see that the Israelis are rattled by the latest steps taken in the Security Council. Netanyahu seems to understand that the Russians are playing a central role in all of this. He's contacted Putin, who's probably the only leader of a BRIC state who Netanyahu is confident will return his call. And he's complained about these Russian actions, Russian support for this draft resolution the Emiratis proposed to the UN Security Council. But we see that despite the careful language, Putin stuck to the Russian position and conceded to Netanyahu no ground. Well, we will see again what happens there. I suspect that there will be more steps taken in the UN over the next couple of days or weeks. The Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu, are committed to continuing their offensive. There continue to be people in Israel who, in fact, want to expand the wall to encompass Hezbollah. There was a rather concerning statement from the Israeli government yesterday, or at least some people within the Israeli government yesterday, which said that Israel can no longer tolerate the presence of Hezbollah on its northern borders. One wonders what that means exactly. But anyway, for the moment, the diplomatic initiative remains with the BRICS. In fact, I predict that it will continue to do so. And Netanyahu's call to Putin shows that the Israelis themselves, despite all the bluster, are becoming nervous. Well, much to say about this, much no doubt is coming in the Middle East, in the Middle East conflict. But this is where I finish today's video. More from me soon, and more updates, no doubt, about the general situation. But in the meantime, let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Remember to check out our shop, where you can find all kinds of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Links, all of these links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.